The retired Marine only took the school bus job because he couldn't afford another Wyoming winter. He hated noise. He hated crowds. And after losing his young son years ago, he hated being around children most of all. But on Route 6, his aging German Shepherd did something that made the entire bus fall silent. The old war dog walked past every child and lay down beside a little girl no one else would sit near. She never spoke, never smiled, and every time a dark blue pickup truck appeared outside the school, her hands began to shake. One freezing night, he found her hiding alone behind a broken trailer in the snow. That was when she whispered, "If he sees me out here again, my mom will cry all night." Before winter ended, a broken veteran, a frightened child, and an old war dog would face the one battle none of them could outrun. Wherever you're watching from tonight, I hope this story brings you warmth. And if stories of loyalty and second chances mean something to you, subscribe and join us. The Wyoming morning was iron gray and breathless, the kind of cold that settled into bone and memory. Snow lay unbroken along the highway outside Red Hollow, and the sky looked as if it had forgotten how to brighten. The school bus engine coughed awake before dawn, its yellow paint dulled by frost. Russell Vance stood beside it with his gloved hands resting on the hood, feeling the vibration through metal and skin. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered but lean from years of manual labor, his posture permanently straight, as if an invisible sergeant still watched him. His face was angular, weathered by desert heat and mountain wind alike, a faint scar tracing the edge of his right temple. His hair, once dark brown, was now threaded with gray at the sides. A short, rough stubble shadowed his jaw, not quite a beard, more the result of indifference than style. His eyes were a muted steel gray, alert but distant, as if always scanning for something no one else could see. The flannel jacket he wore, green and black plaid, thick and worn at the elbows, fit him like armor. Beneath it, a thermal shirt clung to his frame. He moved carefully, deliberately, conserving motion the way soldiers conserve ammunition. Beside him stood Atlas. The German Shepherd was large even by his breed standards, black and tan with a dark saddle across his back and amber eyes that seemed to weigh every movement in the world before responding. His muzzle had begun to frost with age, white spreading along the edges like winter claiming territory. Once a military patrol dog, Atlas carried himself with quiet authority. He did not bark without reason. He did not move without intention. Russell climbed into the driver's seat, and Atlas settled beside him with a low exhale. The smell of vinyl seats and diesel fuel filled the cabin. Russell adjusted the mirror and forced himself to breathe slowly. The job was simple. Pick up the kids. Drop them off. Do not think. Do not feel. He had taken the job because the heating bill had nearly emptied his bank account. The mechanic shop where he repaired farm equipment paid little during winter. Snow silenced work. Snow silenced everything. Except children. The first stop filled the bus with noise. Boots stomped, backpacks thudded, laughter ricocheted against metal walls. Russell's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The chaos pressed against his ears, and for a flicker of a second, the sound blurred into something else. Rotor blades shouted commands, distant detonations. He blinked hard. Wyoming, he told himself, not Fallujah. Atlas lifted his head, sensing the change in Russell's breathing before any human could have. The dog leaned slightly closer, a grounding presence. Russell exhaled. They drove deeper into Red Hollow, past wooden houses half buried in snowdrifts. At the third stop, More children climbed aboard, their voices sharp and bright. At the fourth, Russell noticed her for the first time. Fourth, Russell noticed her for the first time. She stood alone near the curb, thin as a fence post, her coat too large for her narrow frame. The fabric hung past her wrists, sleeves swallowing her hands. Her hair was light brown, pulled back loosely as if she had done it herself without looking in a mirror. Her skin was pale in a way that spoke of winter and worry rather than simple cold. When she stepped onto the bus, she did not look up. Nora Whitaker. Russell would later read her name on the route sheet. She moved straight to the last seat without speaking to anyone. While other children argued over window spots, Nora folded into herself, knees slightly drawn in, hands pressing against her ears. Not dramatically, not in a way meant to be seen, just enough to keep the world at a distance. Two boys near the middle glanced back at her. One snickered. "There goes the ghost," he muttered. The other laughed quietly. Russell caught the reflection in the mirror, but said nothing. He had never been good at intervening in small cruelties. War had taught him to respond to explosions, not whispers. The bus rolled forward again. Noise swelled. Nora's shoulders tightened further. Then Atlas stood up. It was not sudden or aggressive. The old dog simply rose, turned, and began walking down the aisle. Children froze mid-sentence. Someone whispered, "Is he allowed to do that?" Atlas ignored them all. He moved with steady purpose until he reached the final row. Without looking to Russell for permission, he lowered himself beside Nora's boots. For a moment, nothing changed. The bus still rattled, the heater still hissed, but Nora's hands slowly drifted away from her ears. Her fingers hovered uncertainly over Atlas's thick fur, before resting lightly against his shoulder. Atlas did not move. He did not seek attention. He simply remained there. In the mirror, Russell watched Nora's posture shift. Her spine uncurled slightly. The rigid line of her jaw softened. She did not smile, but something inside her loosened. Russell swallowed. Atlas had done this before, back overseas, when frightened villagers would not approach armed soldiers but would approach a dog. Trust, it seemed, traveled differently on four legs. The route continued. Russell told himself it meant nothing. Children liked dogs. Dogs liked children. That was all. But when they reached the school parking lot, Russell noticed something else. A dark blue pickup truck idled near the far edge of the lot. It was older, paint scratched along the sides, exhaust curling in the frozen air. The driver's face was partially hidden beneath a cap, but Russell caught the outline of a man with a heavy beard and a broad neck, thick hands resting on the wheel. Nora saw it too. Her hand stiffened in Atlas's fur. Her breathing changed, quick, shallow. She did not look directly at the truck. She stared instead at the floor between her shoes, as if refusing eye contact might erase its presence. Russell felt a quiet unease settle into his chest. He had learned long ago to read body language. Fear had a rhythm. Nora's fear was not random. It was specific. The pickup remained until the first bell rang. Only then did it pull away, tires crunching over packed snow. Nora stood, adjusting her oversized coat, and stepped off the bus without speaking. Atlas watched her go, ears slightly forward. Russell drove the empty bus back toward the depot, the silence inside almost painful after the noise. He told himself it was none of his business. He was a driver, nothing more. He delivered children from point A to point B. That was the agreement he had made with the world after losing his son 8 years earlier in a collision on an icy road not unlike this one. He had not been driving that day. That fact did nothing to soften the guilt. At the depot, Russell cut the engine and sat in the stillness. Snow drifted across the windshield in delicate patterns. Atlas returned to the front seat and rested his head against Russell's knee. "You don't get attached," Russell murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the dog or to himself. Atlas blinked slowly. That afternoon, when Russell repeated the route in reverse, Nora boarded again in silence. Atlas waited only a few seconds before walking back to her seat once more. This time no one laughed. A few children even leaned sideways to look at the unusual pair. As they approached the edge of town, Russell saw the same dark blue pickup parked near a side street, engine running. He watched Nora in the mirror. She had gone pale again. Her fingers curled into Atlas's fur with quiet desperation. The bus drove past the truck. The man inside turned his head slightly, following them with his eyes. Russell did not yet know the man's name. He did not yet know the story behind Nora's silence. But he knew this much. Atlas had chosen that seat for a reason. And Atlas had never been wrong about danger before. When Russell parked the bus at the final stop and shut off the engine, he sat longer than necessary, staring through the windshield at the winter horizon. Somewhere deep beneath his practiced indifference, something old and protective stirred, a part of him he had buried alongside folded flags and hospital paperwork. He tightened his jaw. He had promised himself never to step into someone else's battle again. Yet as Atlas lifted his head and looked back toward the empty seats where Nora had sat, Russell felt the first crack in that promise. Winter in Red Hollow had only just begun. And something inside that little girl's world was colder than the snow outside. The storm moved in just after noon, swallowing Red Hollow in white before the last school bell had finished ringing. Snow fell hard and sideways, the kind that erased road lines and turned distance into guesswork. By the time Russell Vance pulled Route 6 out of the parking lot, visibility had narrowed to a shifting tunnel of gray. He leaned forward over the steering wheel, flannel jacket collar brushing his jaw, steel gray eyes steady and focused. Atlas remained seated at the front until the bus emptied row by row, and only Nora Whitaker stayed in the back, her thin frame small against the fogged window. The heater struggled. The bus groaned uphill. Children were dropped at driveways where porch lights already glowed in the dim afternoon. When they reached the dirt road that led to the far edge of town, Russell hesitated for a fraction of a second. He could radio the school and report unsafe conditions. He could ask that Nora be picked up tomorrow instead. But the storm was worsening, and leaving a child stranded was not something his conscience allowed. He turned onto the narrow road. The trailer came into view through blowing snow, a faded beige RV set crooked against a stand of leafless cottonwoods. One window was patched with cardboard. The steps leading up to the door sagged slightly to the left. Russell slowed the bus and pulled as close as he could without sliding into the shallow ditch. Atlas rose from his place and stood rigid, ears forward. The trailer door opened before Nora reached it. A man stepped out, tall and broad through the chest, wearing a denim jacket with a gray hood pulled over his head. He was in his late 30s, perhaps early 40s, though his face carried the hard lines of someone who had lived faster than his years. His beard was thick and uneven, dark brown threaded with flecks of premature gray. His eyes were sharp, almost calculating, but his mouth curved into a polite half-smile as he approached the bus steps. His boots crunched through snow with heavy confidence. "Appreciate you bringing her all the way out here," he said, voice smooth and controlled. "Road's a mess." Russell studied him in silence before responding. "Storms worse on the highway." The man nodded, extending a hand. "Wade Mercer." His grip was firm but not crushing, the kind of handshake practiced enough to signal reliability. His skin was rough, knuckles nicked and scarred in places. A faint chemical smell lingered on his clothes, something metallic beneath cheap cologne. "I help out around here. Vivian's not feeling too great lately." Atlas gave a low sound in his throat. Not a bark, not a growl, but a warning vibration that Russell felt more than heard. Wade glanced down at the dog briefly, smile tightening. "He friendly?" "Depends," Russell replied. Nora stepped past them without a word. Wade's hand hovered near her shoulder as if to guide her, but she flinched before contact was made. The movement was quick, almost invisible, but Russell caught it. So did Atlas. The bus drove off slowly, tires slipping before catching traction. In the side mirror, Russell watched the trailer until it disappeared behind snow. His chest felt tight, not from cold, but from recognition. He had seen that flinch before, years ago in civilians caught between patrol routes and insurgents. Fear conditioned by proximity. The rest of the route passed in near silence. By the time Russell parked the bus at the depot, the storm had turned vicious. Wind howled between buildings, lifting snow into spirals that scraped across asphalt. Atlas jumped down from the bus and followed Russell to his truck, a dark green Ford with rust along the wheel wells. Russell did not start the engine right away. He sat, hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying the image of Nora's recoil. He told himself again that he was only the bus driver, that he had no right to intervene in family matters. But the image would not leave. That night, the wind rattled the windows of Russell's small rental house at the edge of town. The house had once belonged to a railroad worker decades earlier. The paint was chipped, the porch sagging slightly. Russell stood by the window in his flannel jacket, watching snow accumulate against the fence line. Atlas lay near the door, head up, listening. Russell tried to distract himself by cleaning the shotgun he had not fired in months, but the steady rhythm of metal against cloth could not quiet his thoughts. Around 9 o'clock, he made a decision he told himself was practical. He would drive past the trailer to make sure the road remained passable in the morning. That was all. The dirt road was nearly impassable by the time he reached it. Snow swallowed the tire tracks from earlier. He drove slowly, headlights cutting through white. When the trailer came into view, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The front door stood slightly ajar. Light flickered inside. He parked a short distance away and stepped out, boots sinking into snow up to his ankles. Atlas followed immediately, fur dusted with white. The wind carried voices, one raised, sharp, the other strained and low. Russell approached cautiously, stopping just short of the steps. Through the gap in the door, he saw Nora standing near the kitchenette, shoulders hunched, hands clasped together tightly. Across from her stood Wade, face flushed, movements abrupt. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Wade snapped, voice barely audible over wind, but sharp enough to cut. "You think I don't see you watching?" Nora shook her head quickly. "I'm not—" The rest of her words were swallowed by wind. Russell's jaw tightened. Atlas stepped forward instinctively, but Russell placed a hand lightly on the dog's neck. He did not yet have proof of anything criminal. He had suspicion and instinct. Neither would stand up to law enforcement if he misstepped. A second figure appeared from the narrow hallway. A woman, tall and slender, moving with visible fatigue. Vivian Whitaker was in her mid-30s. Her once blonde hair faded to a dull honey color and pulled into a loose bun at the nape of her neck. Her skin carried a pale translucence common in those recovering from serious illness. A faint scar traced downward from beneath her collarbone, disappearing beneath the neckline of her sweater. Her posture leaned slightly forward, as if conserving energy with every step. Despite exhaustion, her eyes held a quiet intelligence, cautious but not defeated. "Wade," she said, voice strained but steady. "That's enough." Wade's shoulders stiffened, but he stepped back. "Just making sure she understands," he muttered. Vivian noticed the open door and the silhouette beyond it. Her gaze locked with Russell's. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something else. Relief, perhaps, or embarrassment. She stepped closer to the doorway. "Mr. Vance?" Russell cleared his throat. "Road's closing up fast. Just checking it's safe out here." Vivian nodded quickly. "We're fine. Thank you." Her voice wavered slightly, not from cold, but from the effort of maintaining control. Wade approached the door, expression rearranged into polite neutrality. "Appreciate the concern," he said evenly. "We've got it handled." Atlas did not move. His amber eyes remained fixed on Wade, unblinking. Wade shifted his weight subtly, discomfort flickering through his stance before he masked it again. Russell hesitated, then nodded once. "Morning pickup might be delayed if the drifts get worse." "We'll be ready," Vivian replied softly. Back in his truck, Russell exhaled slowly. He had not intervened. He had not accused. Yet the unease in his chest deepened. Atlas turned once in the seat, then settled, though his ears remained slightly angled backward, alert. The next morning, the storm had eased but left behind a world reshaped by snow. Russell arrived at the trailer stop slightly later than usual due to drifts along the route. Nora stood outside alone, boots half buried in snow, coat zipped unevenly. There were dark circles beneath her eyes. She climbed aboard without looking back. Atlas walked to her immediately. This time she pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder. Russell pretended not to notice, though his throat tightened unexpectedly. Halfway through the route, as they passed the edge of town, the dark blue pickup appeared again, parked near the gas station, engine idling. Wade sat inside watching the bus. Nora's breathing changed instantly. Russell caught the moment in the mirror. Fear had a pattern, and this pattern was consistent. Russell drove on, pulse steady but mind calculating. He did not know yet what Wade Mercer was involved in, but he knew two things with certainty. Nora's fear was not imagined, and Atlas trusted his instincts more than Russell trusted his own restraint. When the bus finally emptied at the school, Russell remained seated a moment longer than necessary. Atlas returned to the front, resting his head on Russell's knee. Outside, snow glittered deceptively under a thin sun. Russell understood something now that he had not wanted to admit the night before. He was no longer simply observing. He had stepped into the orbit of that trailer the moment he chose to turn down the dirt road. Whether he liked it or not, the winter ahead would not allow him to remain a bystander. And somewhere behind cardboard-covered windows and sagging steps, tension was building faster than the storm that had brought them there. The storm passed, but winter did not. Snow settled into hard ridges along the roads of Red Hollow, turning each morning into an obstacle course of ice and shadow. Russell Vance kept his routine precise. He arrived at the depot 15 minutes early. He inspected the bus himself. He avoided unnecessary conversation. The green and black plaid flannel jacket he wore had begun to smell faintly of diesel and cold metal, a scent that felt familiar, almost reassuring. Atlas followed him everywhere, black and tan coat thick against the cold, amber eyes alert beneath a muzzle that showed more silver each week. Russell told himself he had boundaries. He was not Nora Whitaker's guardian. He was not law enforcement. He was not family. He was simply the driver of Route 6. Yet Atlas no longer behaved as if that were true. The German shepherd moved automatically toward the last seat each morning, settling beside Nora without waiting for instruction. Nora no longer flinched when he approached. She placed one careful hand against his shoulder and let herself breathe. The other children had grown accustomed to the arrangement. A few even smiled at Atlas as they passed. Nora herself began to change in small, nearly invisible ways. She sat one row closer to the front on Tuesdays. She raised her head when Russell said her name during roll call. She started bringing a small spiral notebook to the bus, drawing with dull-colored pencils during the ride. Russell caught glimpses in the rearview mirror. Careful lines, patient shading, most often the outline of Atlas's ears or the curve of his back. Once he noticed she had drawn the bus interior with surprising detail, including the dent in the third seat on the left and the faint crack near the window frame. She missed nothing. Russell did not know how to respond to this kind of quiet trust. He had learned to respond to gunfire, to commands shouted across static radios. He had never learned how to answer a child who slowly chose to sit closer. The memory of his own son rose unexpectedly at times, not as a clear image but as a sensation. A small hand slipping into his palm, a laugh echoing down a hallway. He would clamp down on the thought before it could fully form. Attachment led to loss. That was a rule he had carved into himself. One Thursday morning, as the bus climbed a narrow incline just outside town, a metal lunchbox tumbled from a seat and struck the floor with a violent clang. The sound ricocheted through the metal cabin, sharp and sudden. Russell's breath caught. For an instant, the windshield became a dust-choked street in Iraq, and the clang turned into something far worse. His pulse spiked. He braked too hard. The bus jerked. Children gasped. "Sit down!" he barked, voice louder and harsher than he intended. The command echoed with an edge that did not belong in a school bus. Silence fell immediately. In the back, Nora had pressed both hands over her ears again. Her notebook slid to the floor. Tears pooled but did not spill. Russell saw it in the mirror, the way her shoulders collapsed inward, the trust retreating as quickly as it had come. Shame hit him harder than any battlefield memory. He eased his grip on the wheel and forced himself to breathe. "Everyone okay?" he asked, voice rougher now, lower. A few children nodded cautiously. The rest avoided eye contact. The ride continued in tense quiet. Atlas rose slowly and walked back to Nora, placing his body between her and the aisle as if shielding her from sound itself. She leaned against him, eyes closed. Russell swallowed the apology that stuck in his throat. He did not know how to say it without unraveling something deeper inside himself. After school, when the bus emptied and the route reversed, Nora boarded again without looking at him. She sat farther back this time, pressing close to Atlas, but not meeting Russell's gaze. The distance between them felt wider than the aisle itself. That evening, Russell parked the bus and found something on the floor near the last seat. Nora's spiral notebook had slipped beneath the bench. He picked it up, hesitated, then opened it only to confirm the owner before returning it. What he saw made him stop. The drawing was simple but precise. It showed the interior of the bus, colored in muted yellows and grays. Atlas was drawn large in the center, detailed and strong. Beside him, a smaller figure with light brown hair sat upright. At the front of the bus, behind the wheel, was a man with squared shoulders and steady eyes. Above the drawing, in careful letters, Nora had written, "Safe." Russell closed the notebook slowly. He sat alone in the driver's seat long after the engine had gone silent. Safe. The word struck him with unexpected force. He had not considered that anyone might feel that way because of him. The next morning, he made a decision that felt like stepping across a line. After finishing the route and ensuring the children were inside the school building, he drove his truck toward the edge of town. Snowbanks still crowded the dirt road leading to the Whitaker trailer. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the horizon. When Russell knocked on the trailer door, it was Vivian Whitaker who answered. In daylight, her fragility was more evident. She wore a thick cardigan over a faded shirt, sleeves pushed back to reveal thin wrists. The scar from her surgery was faintly visible near her collarbone. Her pale blue eyes held both gratitude and caution. She carried herself with quiet resilience, the kind built from surviving more than one hardship without complaint. "Mr. Vance," she said softly, stepping aside to let cold air escape. "Is everything all right?" "I found this on the bus," he replied, holding out the notebook. Vivian's expression shifted to relief. She thought she lost it. She glanced back into the narrow living space. "Nora, honey?" Nora appeared from the hallway, eyes wary. When she saw the notebook in Russell's hand, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Embarrassment. Maybe fear that he had seen too much. "I didn't mean to look," Russell said quickly. "Just wanted to make sure it got back to you." Nora took the notebook carefully. Their eyes met for only a second. But in that second, Russell saw the question there. "Are you still safe?" Before he could answer, a movement near the small kitchen counter caught his attention. Wade Mercer stood partially obscured by the doorway, arms crossed. In daylight, the sharpness of his features was more apparent. His beard had been trimmed, revealing a strong jawline with a faint scar along the left side. His eyes were darker than Russell remembered, not cold but guarded. There was tension in the way he held his shoulders, as if expecting accusation at any moment. "Everything good?" Wade asked, tone neutral but edged. "Just returning something left on the bus," Russell replied. Wade nodded once, stepping forward. His boots left wet tracks on the thin linoleum floor. "Appreciate that." His gaze lingered on Russell longer than necessary, assessing, measuring. Atlas stepped into the doorway beside Russell, tail low but body firm. Wade's eyes dropped briefly to the dog before returning upward. A faint crease formed between his brows. As Russell turned to leave, he noticed something near the small couch. Nora's backpack lay open, contents partially spilled. Wade followed his gaze and shifted slightly, blocking the view. "You folks stay warm," Russell said evenly. Outside, the cold felt sharper than before. Russell walked back to his truck slowly, Atlas close at his side. He did not know what Wade had been searching for, but he knew instinctively that it was not homework. That night, Russell lay awake longer than usual. The word safe replayed in his mind. He thought about the flinch he had seen, the way Wade's posture changed when observed, the open backpack. He understood now that indifference would not shield him from involvement. The line had already been crossed the moment Atlas chose the last seat. Winter tightened its grip on Red Hollow, but something else tightened too. A sense that the quiet on Route 6 was only the surface of a deeper current. Russell had spent years avoiding the role of protector. Yet the world, it seemed, had decided to hand it back to him one bus stop at a time. The temperature dropped without warning just after midnight, as if winter had decided the day had not been cruel enough. Wind drove fresh snow across Red Hollow in long, restless sheets, rattling shutters and erasing tire tracks left only hours before. Russell Vance had not yet fallen asleep. He sat at his small kitchen table under a single dim light, flannel jacket still on his shoulders, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. Atlas lay near the door, head resting on his paws, but eyes open, listening to the storm. Russell had been replaying the look on Nora's face when she took back her notebook, the single word written above the drawing. Safe. He did not know how to carry that responsibility. He did not know how to deserve it. The knock came not at the door, but against the window, frantic and uneven. Russell stood immediately, chair scraping hard across the floor. He moved toward the sound, pulling the curtain aside. Through blowing snow, he saw a small figure struggling against the wind, arms raised. Nora Whitaker's coat flapped open at the bottom, hair plastered against her cheeks. Even from inside, Russell could see she was trembling. He opened the door without hesitation. Nora stumbled forward into the warmth, boots soaked through, breath coming in sharp bursts. Atlas rose instantly and pressed against her side, his thick black and tan coat absorbing flakes of snow as if shielding her from the storm even indoors. "Mom," Nora managed between breaths. "She can't breathe." Russell did not ask for details. He grabbed his truck keys from the counter and wrapped an extra blanket around Nora's shoulders. "Stay close," he said, voice steady now, stripped of hesitation. Atlas followed them into the truck without command. The dirt road to the trailer was nearly invisible under the new snowfall. Russell drove with both hands firm on the wheel, leaning forward as if willing the headlights to cut deeper into the white. Nora sat in the passenger seat, clutching Atlas's fur, her fingers white with pressure. The dog remained upright between them, bracing with each turn, eyes alert but calm. Russell's heart pounded not from fear of the road, but from the urgency in Nora's voice. He had heard that tone before, in radio calls requesting medevac support. It was the sound of time running thin. The trailer door was open when they arrived, banging against its frame in the wind. Russell rushed inside. Vivian Whitaker lay half-curled on the narrow couch, one hand pressed to her chest, the other gripping the edge of a cushion as if holding herself in place. Her skin had lost even the fragile color it usually held. She looked almost translucent under the dim overhead light. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, each inhale a battle. Sweat beaded along her temples despite the cold. Russell knelt beside her. "Vivian, can you hear me?" She nodded faintly, lips parted but unable to form full words. "Heart," she whispered. Russell recognized the signs. He had carried wounded men who looked just like this, shock creeping in, systems failing quietly. He turned to Nora. "Grab her coat. We're taking her now." Atlas remained near Nora, leaning his body against her as she fumbled with fabric and fear. Russell lifted Vivian carefully, surprised by how little she weighed. She was taller than Nora, but thin to the point of fragility, her once strong frame worn down by illness and exhaustion. He carried her through the storm to the truck, settling her in the back seat. Nora climbed in beside her, wrapping the blanket tightly around her mother's shoulders. Atlas jumped up and positioned himself partly across Nora's legs, radiating warmth. The drive to Red Hollow Medical Center was slow and deliberate. Snow had turned the highway into a narrow corridor of guesswork. Russell kept his eyes fixed ahead, breathing controlled, ignoring the tremor that threatened his focus. He spoke to Vivian in low, even tones, urging her to stay awake. Nora whispered reassurances, voice breaking. Atlas pressed closer whenever Vivian's breathing faltered. They reached the emergency entrance after what felt like hours, but could not have been more than 20 minutes. Inside, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows over white walls. A nurse hurried toward them, a woman in her late 40s with tightly pulled auburn hair and sharp, attentive eyes behind rectangular glasses. Her name tag read Melissa Crane. She moved with practiced efficiency, taking one look at Vivian's condition and calling for assistance. "Cardiac history?" Melissa asked briskly as they transferred Vivian to a gurney. "Valve surgery last year," Vivian managed weakly. Melissa nodded, already issuing instructions to two orderlies who appeared from a side hallway. Her tone softened slightly when she glanced at Nora. "We've got her. You did the right thing bringing her in." Nora's grip on Atlas tightened. Russell rested a hand lightly on her shoulder, uncertain but present. The waiting room was nearly empty at that hour. A vending machine hummed in the corner, its fluorescent glow stark against beige walls. Nora sat rigidly beside Russell, boots leaving small puddles on the linoleum. Atlas lay at her feet, eyes half closed but ears twitching at every distant sound. Russell's mind drifted unwillingly to another hospital years earlier, another waiting room, another outcome he had been powerless to change. He forced himself back to the present. After what felt like an eternity, Melissa returned. "She's stable," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It was an acute cardiac episode. She needs monitoring and adjustment to her medication. Stress isn't helping her condition." Her eyes lingered on Russell briefly, as if measuring whether he understood the weight of that word. Nora exhaled a breath she had been holding since the knock at the window. Russell nodded once. "Thank you." They remained at the hospital until dawn brushed the horizon pale gray. When they returned to the trailer later that morning, exhaustion hung heavy in the air. Russell insisted on checking the heating unit and the loose wiring near the kitchenette, practical tasks that required no emotional articulation. Nora moved quietly around the small space, gathering scattered items back into place. Atlas wandered slowly through the trailer, nose low to the floor. He paused near the couch where Vivian usually sat, then shifted toward the small table beneath the window. His ears angled forward, and he nudged something beneath a stack of old mail. Russell noticed the shift immediately. "What is it?" he murmured. Atlas pawed lightly at the edge of the table. Russell bent down and slid aside a loose panel in the thin plywood beneath. Hidden in the narrow space was a small ledger notebook bound in cheap black vinyl. Its pages were filled with neat handwriting, license plate numbers, dates, times, amounts of cash listed in columns. Russell flipped through a few pages, jaw tightening. These were not grocery lists. These were schedules, patterns. Vivian's voice came from the doorway behind him. She had returned from the hospital earlier than Russell expected, pale but upright, refusing to remain under observation longer than necessary due to cost. She leaned against the frame for support. "I was going to burn it," she said quietly, "but I was afraid, if I did, he'd think I'd already talked." Russell stood slowly. "Talked about what?" Vivian met his gaze, and for the first time since he had known her, there was no attempt to soften the truth. "Wade's been running product through the mountain pass since last winter. Fentanyl. Small loads at first, then bigger. He needed someone to track deliveries. I needed surgery. It didn't feel like a choice at the time." Her words hung heavy in the small trailer. Nora stared at the floor, absorbing more than a child should. Atlas moved closer to her instinctively. "I didn't know how deep it went," Vivian continued, voice trembling but steady. "I just wrote what he told me to write. Plate numbers, drop times, cash counts. I told myself it was temporary." She swallowed hard. "He's been getting nervous. Thinks someone's watching him." Russell closed the ledger carefully. His mind worked through implications, risks, consequences. He had stepped into something far beyond family tension. Yet he felt no surprise, only confirmation of the unease that had been building since the first flinch in the bus mirror. That evening, as snow resumed its slow descent over Red Hollow, Russell returned home with Atlas and the ledger secured in a sealed envelope. He planned to contact someone outside the county, someone who would not dismiss a veteran's suspicion as paranoia. But before he could make that call, his phone buzzed with a notification from a local news alert. Suspicious vehicle reported leaving town during storm. No details, only a grainy image attached. It was the dark blue pickup. Russell's pulse slowed rather than quickened. Wade Mercer had not stayed to face whatever storm was coming. He had taken his truck, and likely more, with him into the mountains. Back at the trailer, Nora stood by the window watching headlights disappear down the distant highway. Vivian rested in a chair, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Winter had tightened its grip, but something else had shifted. The man who had hovered like a shadow at the edge of their lives was gone. For now. And Russell knew the quiet that followed would not last. Morning came thin and brittle over Red Hollow. The sky washed pale as bone beneath a restless wind. Snow still drifted across the open stretches beyond town, and the mountain pass north of the county line had turned into a narrow white scar barely visible from the highway. Russell Vance stood beside his dark green Ford, green and black flannel jacket zipped to his throat, breath rising in steady clouds. In his hand was the sealed envelope containing Vivian Whitaker's ledger. He had made his decision sometime before dawn. He would drive it himself to the State Patrol office in Millbrook, 30 miles east, beyond the jurisdiction of anyone who might look the other way for Wade Mercer. He did not trust local discretion. He trusted patterns, evidence, and distance. Atlas watched him closely, head tilted slightly, black and tan coat gleaming against the snow. The dog's muzzle looked whiter this morning, frost clinging to silver fur. He sensed Russell's tension before the engine even turned over. Russell drove first to the Whitaker trailer. The dirt road had been plowed in a single rough strip, snow piled high on either side like walls. He knocked twice. Vivian answered, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, her face still drawn from the previous night, but stronger than before. She looked smaller in the morning light, yet something in her posture suggested resolve. "I'm taking it in," Russell said quietly, holding up the envelope. Vivian nodded once. Her pale blue eyes searched his face. "He'll know," she said softly. "If he hears I talked—" "He's already gone," Russell replied. "If he comes back, it won't be because of this. It'll be because he's desperate." Nora stood in the narrow hallway behind her mother, silent but alert. She had been listening. Russell caught the shift in her shoulders, the way she drew inward when the word desperate was spoken. He crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "You stay with your mom today. No bus." She nodded without argument. Atlas stepped forward and brushed his shoulder against her leg, a brief reassurance. By the time Russell left the trailer, snow had begun to fall again, lighter this time, but persistent. He drove carefully toward the highway, mind mapping contingencies. He would drop the ledger, return before dark, check on Vivian again. That was the plan. Plans were steady things. They gave shape to uncertainty. He had just reached the edge of town when his phone vibrated against the dashboard. A text message from an unknown number. "You think you're helping. You're making it worse." No signature, no context. But Russell did not need one. His grip tightened on the wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror. No blue pickup. no visible tail. Still, the message carried weight. He considered turning back. He considered calling the state patrol from the road instead. He chose to continue. Halfway up the mountain approach, wind intensified, driving snow sideways across the windshield. The road narrowed, trees closing in on either side. Russell leaned forward, scanning for tire tracks. Wade knew these roads. If he had left town, he would likely take the old logging route that cut across the ridge and down toward the county line. Russell's phone vibrated again. This time it was a missed call from Vivian. He pulled over to the shoulder, heart already pounding. When he returned the call, it went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. A third message arrived, this one from Nora's number. It contained only a single sentence. "I'm sorry." Russell felt the blood drain from his face. He reversed hard, tires spinning briefly before catching. Atlas lifted his head sharply, sensing the shift. Back in Red Hollow, the Whitaker trailer door stood open again. Snow had begun to collect on the threshold. Vivian sat in a chair near the window, pale and shaking. "She was in the hallway," she said, voice cracking. "I thought she was in the bathroom. I didn't hear her leave." Russell scanned the interior quickly. Nora's boots were gone. Her small knit hat was missing from the hook near the door. The ledger envelope still sat on the kitchen table where Russell had left it briefly before stepping outside earlier. "She heard us," Vivian whispered. "About the ledger. About him." Russell understood immediately. In a child's logic, disappearance could equal protection. If Nora believed Wade would hurt her mother because of her, she would remove herself from the equation. Atlas was already at the doorway, nose low to the snow. Russell followed without hesitation. Outside, the wind had begun to erase footprints, but the dog moved with precision, weaving slightly until he locked onto a direction leading away from town, toward the narrow cut that led into the older mountain route. Russell returned to the truck and drove slowly along the road Atlas indicated. Every few hundred yards, he stopped, letting the dog jump down and confirm the trail before continuing. Snow deepened as they climbed. Branches bowed under weight. The world felt emptied of everything but wind and white. About a mile from the main road, Russell spotted a faint disturbance near the ditch. Small prints half filled with snow. He stopped immediately. Atlas leapt down and followed the line toward a gap in the trees where the old logging road began. The logging route had not been plowed in years. It was a ribbon of uneven terrain cutting through forest, once used to haul timber decades earlier. Russell parked at the entrance and shut off the engine. "We walk from here," he said, voice low. Atlas was already moving. Snow reached nearly to Russell's knees in places. Each step required effort. He focused on Atlas's tail ahead of him, dark against white. The dog paused occasionally, recalibrating, then pressed forward. After nearly half an hour of slow progress, they reached a clearing where the wind struck harder. There, near a cluster of fallen logs, Russell saw her. Nora stood facing downhill, coat whipped by wind, small frame rigid against the cold. "Nora!" he called, but the wind tore the sound away. She turned slowly. Her cheeks were red from cold, eyes wide not with panic, but with determination. "If I'm not there," she shouted, voice barely carrying, "he won't come back." Russell closed the distance between them carefully. "That's not how it works." "He said he doesn't like loose ends," she replied, repeating something she must have overheard. "If I'm gone, he won't need to fix anything." Russell knelt in front of her, ignoring the snow soaking through his jeans. "Listen to me. You don't fix danger by becoming it. Her chin trembled, but she did not cry. She had come prepared to endure, not to collapse. Atlas pressed against her side, anchoring her in place. Russell's voice softened despite the wind. I stayed away from people because I thought losing them once was enough. I thought if I didn't care, I wouldn't feel it again. That's not strength. That's hiding. Nora looked at him. Confusion and hope tangled together. My son died 8 winters ago, Russell continued quietly. I couldn't protect him from the ice on the road. I've been punishing myself for that ever since. I don't get to lose another child because I was too afraid to care. The confession hung between them heavier than the snow. Russell had never said those words aloud outside a therapist's office years earlier. The wind howled, but something inside him felt still for the first time in a long while. Mom won't be safe if he thinks we told, Nora insisted, though her voice had weakened. Your mom is safer with you beside her than with you missing, Russell replied firmly. And Wade running doesn't make him powerful. It makes him scared. Behind them, the truck engine coughed unexpectedly. Russell's head snapped up. He had left it running earlier for warmth while scouting the entrance. Now, as he tried to start it again after helping Nora back down the logging route, the engine sputtered and died. The battery had drained faster than he anticipated in the cold. Russell sat in the driver's seat, turning the key once more. Nothing but a hollow click. The white road ahead stretched empty. His breath fogged the windshield. Nora sat quietly in the passenger seat. Atlas pressed against her for warmth. For a fleeting moment, despair threatened to rise again. The same helplessness he had felt in another winter long ago. He closed his eyes briefly. Atlas nudged his arm sharply. Not gently, not reassuringly. It was a command. Russell opened his eyes and laughed once under his breath. All right, he murmured. He stepped out into the snow and popped the hood. He knew engines. He knew cold. He adjusted connections, scraped ice from the terminals with a multi-tool he kept in his pocket. His fingers burned with numbness. After several tense minutes, he climbed back in and turned the key. The engine roared to life. They drove back toward town slowly, Nora silent but calmer. Atlas lay between them, breathing steadily. When they reached the trailer, Vivian rushed outside despite the cold, wrapping Nora in her arms. Russell watched from the truck, flannel jacket stiff with frost. He knew now that the line he had crossed could not be uncrossed. He would still deliver the ledger. He would still make the call. But this time, he would not do it alone in the dark. The white road had nearly swallowed them that day, but it had also stripped something away from Russell, an illusion that distance could protect him from involvement. And as snow continued to fall over Red Hollow, one truth stood clearer than the tracks behind them. Nora had run to disappear. Russell had followed because he no longer intended to. The mountain road narrowed into silence long before the church came into view. Snow clung thick to the pine branches, bending them low as if the forest itself were bowing under winter's weight. Russell Vance drove slowly, green and black flannel jacket stiff with dried frost from the day before, his hands steady but alert on the wheel. Atlas sat upright beside him, older muscles tense, amber eyes fixed ahead as though reading a map no human could see. The sky was a flat sheet of white, and the air carried that strange hush that settles just before something breaks. They had followed faint tire impressions leading off the logging route and up toward an abandoned Methodist chapel built in the early 1900s. Russell remembered it vaguely from years past. A wooden structure with peeling paint and a steeple that leaned slightly east as if the wind had been arguing with it for decades. The place had not held regular services in years. The congregation had dwindled until the doors closed quietly one spring. When the chapel finally emerged between the trees, Russell felt a tightening in his chest. The building stood alone in a shallow clearing, its windows frosted over, front steps partially buried in snow. A dark blue pickup truck sat crooked near the side entrance, engine still warm, judging by the faint curl of exhaust drifting into the cold. "Stay close," Russell murmured, though Atlas was already moving. The front door creaked when Russell pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder than outside, trapped and stale. Wooden pews lined the narrow aisle, some tilted slightly from age. A thin layer of snow had blown in near the doorway, dusting the floorboards. At the far end of the room, near the pulpit, stood Wade Mercer. He had removed his jacket, revealing a gray thermal shirt stretched across a broad chest. His beard looked less composed than usual, wind-tangled and uneven. Dark circles marked the skin beneath his eyes, giving him a gaunt, restless appearance. He was not holding a weapon. Instead, one hand gripped the back of a pew, knuckles pale, as if grounding himself. Nora Whitaker stood several feet away from him, small against the open space of the chapel. Her coat hung loose around her shoulders. She did not appear restrained. She appeared determined. Russell stepped forward slowly. "You don't want this," he said evenly. Wade exhaled a humorless laugh. "You think I planned this?" His voice was rougher than before, stripped of its earlier politeness. "I was going to drive south, get out before anyone started digging." He glanced toward the door. Then she showed up. Nora's chin lifted slightly. "I came because you won't hurt Mom if I'm not there." The words hung in the cold air. Wade's jaw tightened. He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Less anger now, more exhaustion. "You think I want to hurt her?" he muttered. "You think I signed up for any of this?" Russell studied him carefully. Wade's posture lacked the arrogance of a mastermind. It carried the instability of a man cornered by his own decisions. There was tension in his shoulders, yes, but also confusion, regret layered beneath pride. Russell had seen men like this before, soldiers who made one desperate choice and then built more desperate choices on top of it until escape felt impossible. "You ran," Russell said. "That doesn't look like control." Wade's eyes flicked toward the envelope visible in Russell's jacket pocket. "You've got the book." "Yes." Silence thickened between them. Snow tapped softly against the chapel windows. A new voice interrupted from the side doorway. "This ain't how you fix it, Wade." Russell turned sharply. A tall man stepped into view, shoulders narrow but posture upright despite his age. His hair was white and thin, combed back neatly. Deep lines cut across his face, not harsh but weathered, the kind formed from decades of both prayer and disappointment. He wore a heavy brown coat over a dark suit, collar turned up against the cold. His name, Russell would later recall, was Reverend Thomas Caldwell, the last minister to serve this church before attendance dwindled. Though officially retired, he lived in a small cabin further down the ridge and checked on the chapel occasionally. Caldwell's eyes were clear blue and unwavering. He looked at Wade not with accusation, but with firm familiarity. "I heard the truck," he said calmly, "and I knew it couldn't be anything good." Wade's shoulders sagged slightly. "Not your business, Reverend." "It stopped being just yours the moment a child got involved," Caldwell replied. His voice carried the steady cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime mediating conflicts far smaller and far larger than this one. Nora took a tentative step forward. "If you leave," she said to Wade, "Mom won't have to be scared anymore, right?" Wade looked at her fully now. For a moment, his hard expression faltered. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "It doesn't end just because I drive away." Russell saw it then. The fracture in Wade's resolve. Not a villain's malice, but a man trapped by debts and expectations. The ledger had been leverage. It had also been evidence of how deep he had sunk. Outside, faint in the distance, came the rising echo of sirens carried thinly through the trees. Russell had called the state patrol before leaving town, sending them coordinates and a description. He had hoped they would intercept Wade before it came to this. Wade heard it too. His head snapped toward the door. Panic flared across his face. "You think they'll listen?" he said bitterly. "You think they'll just let me walk?" "That depends on you," Russell replied. The sirens grew louder. Wade stepped backward instinctively. Nora reached out, touching his sleeve. "If you stop running," she said, voice trembling but brave, "maybe Mom can stop too." For a split second, Russell believed Wade might surrender. The man's breathing slowed, shoulders lowering as if he were considering it. Then, survival instinct overrode everything else. He pulled away gently from Nora and moved toward the side exit. "I can't," he said hoarsely. Reverend Caldwell stepped aside rather than block him. "Running won't quiet what's inside you," he warned. Wade pushed through the door into the snow. "Nora, stay!" Russell commanded. But the girl darted forward, not chasing but reacting to sudden movement. Atlas sprang into motion before Russell could. Despite his age, despite the stiffness that sometimes slowed him in the mornings, the German shepherd launched through the doorway with controlled force. His paws struck snow hard, sending powder into the air. The clearing behind the chapel sloped downward into thicker forest. Wade ran unevenly, boots slipping on packed ice. Nora stopped near the edge of the slope, fear returning as reality replaced determination. Russell reached her side and gripped her shoulders firmly. "You stay with me." Ahead of them, Wade lost his footing. He slid several feet before catching himself against a tree trunk. Atlas closed the distance, not attacking, but positioning himself between Wade and the deeper forest. The dog stood broad and solid, chest forward, tail steady, not aggressive, but immovable. Sirens cut through the trees louder now. Wade looked at Atlas, then back at Russell. Snow gathered in his beard, melting slowly. "You're going to let a dog decide this?" he called out, breath ragged. "No," Russell answered calmly. "You are." For several long seconds, Wade remained frozen, chest heaving. Then something inside him gave way. He lowered his head, hands rising slowly above his shoulders. The state patrol vehicles emerged between the trees moments later, lights flashing blue against white. Two troopers stepped out carefully, weapons lowered but ready. The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered woman in her early 30s with tightly braided dark hair and sharp, focused eyes, approached first. Her name tag read Sergeant Elena Ramirez. She carried herself with the discipline of someone who had risen quickly through the ranks by refusing to be underestimated. Her gaze flicked from Wade to Russell to Nora, assessing the scene in a single sweep. "Everyone step back," she ordered, voice firm but controlled. Wade complied without resistance. As the troopers secured him, Russell felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. This was not a dramatic takedown. It was not a battle. It was the quiet collapse of a man who had run out of road. Nora stood close to Atlas, fingers buried in his fur. The dog's breathing was heavier now, sides rising and falling more noticeably. Age had caught up with him during that sprint. but he remained upright, watchful. Sergeant Ramirez approached Russell after Wade was placed in the patrol vehicle. "You the one who called it in?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded once, eyes steady. "You may have saved more than you know." Russell glanced down at Nora. Snow clung to her eyelashes. "Let's go home," he said gently. As the patrol cars drove away with Wade in the back seat, the clearing returned to silence. The old chapel stood unchanged, weathered but intact. Reverend Caldwell watched from the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. Winter had nearly pushed them all to the edge, but this time, no one had fallen. And as Russell guided Nora back toward the truck, Atlas limping only slightly beside them, he understood that sometimes the hardest battles were not won with force, but with the refusal to abandon someone when fear told you to. The wind eased after the patrol cars disappeared down the mountain road, leaving the forest wrapped in a stillness that felt almost fragile. Snow no longer slashed sideways. It drifted gently now, settling over the tracks left by boots and tires alike. Russell Vance stood beside his truck, green and black flannel jacket dusted white, watching as Sergeant Elena Ramirez's cruiser lights faded into the trees. Atlas leaned against his leg, breathing slower but heavier than usual, the sprint through deep snow having cost him more than he allowed anyone to see. Nora Whitaker held on to the dog's thick black and tan fur, her small fingers buried near his collarbone as if anchoring herself to something steady. The events at the chapel had unfolded quickly, yet their weight lingered. Wade Mercer had not fought when the troopers placed him in cuffs. He had not cursed. He had not pleaded. His face, framed by a frost-stiff beard, had looked strangely hollow as he passed Russell. Not hatred, not even anger, just exhaustion. Russell recognized that look too well. On the drive back toward Red Hollow, Nora sat quietly in the front seat beside Russell, while Atlas stretched across the space between them, his head resting partially against the center console. Russell kept one hand loosely on the steering wheel and the other occasionally brushing the dog's shoulder, reassuring himself that Atlas was steady. He could feel the slight tremor beneath the fur. Age was no longer a whisper. It was becoming visible in moments like this. "Is he going to prison?" Nora asked finally, voice small but direct. Russell considered the question carefully. "That depends on what he's done and what he admits to," he replied. "But he won't be coming back to your trailer tonight." Nora nodded, absorbing the information with more maturity than her years should have required. Snow-lined pines slid past the windows as they descended from the ridge. When they reached the Whitaker trailer, Vivian stepped outside despite the cold, shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her posture was straighter than it had been days earlier, though fatigue still shadowed her face. She moved carefully down the steps and wrapped Nora in a tight embrace. Russell remained near the truck, giving them space, Atlas lowering himself slowly to the snow with a heavy exhale. Later that evening, after Vivian insisted Russell come inside for coffee as thanks, the small trailer felt warmer than it had before. The heater hummed steadily, and the air no longer carried the tension that had once filled every corner. Vivian moved more confidently now, though each motion still required measured effort. She had tied her honey-blonde hair back loosely, strands escaping along her temples. Her pale blue eyes held gratitude, but also a new steadiness that Russell had not seen before. "You didn't have to go up there," she said quietly, setting a chipped mug in front of him. "Yes, I did," Russell answered simply. He did not elaborate. Atlas lay near Nora's feet, occasionally lifting his head when she shifted. Russell watched the two of them and felt something inside himself shift as well. He had not merely intervened in a dangerous situation. He had turned back when instinct might have told him to let consequences fall where they would. The following morning, Red Hollow woke under a pale sun that reflected sharply off untouched snow. Word traveled quickly in small towns. By the time Russell arrived at the depot in his flannel jacket, a few fellow drivers had already heard about the arrest in the mountains. They avoided direct questions, but glances lingered longer than usual. Russell ignored them. He had spent years navigating looks that carried assumptions. At mid-morning, Russell received a call from Sergeant Ramirez requesting his presence at the county building to provide a formal statement. He agreed without hesitation. Atlas accompanied him, as always. The county building sat near the center of town, a modest brick structure with narrow windows and a single American flag fluttering stiffly in the cold. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued. Ramirez met him in a small interview room. Up close, her presence carried quiet authority. She stood about 5'8", strong posture, dark eyes observant and precise. Her braided hair fell neatly over one shoulder, and a thin scar traced along her right wrist. A mark, she later mentioned casually, from a childhood accident that had nearly cost her the use of that hand. It had not. Ramirez was known for resilience and patience, traits forged during her years working rural patrol, where backup was often miles away. "We recovered more than expected from Mercer's truck," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "He wasn't just running product through the pass. He'd gotten in deeper than he could manage." Russell nodded. He looked like a man running out of options. Ramirez studied him briefly. "You had a choice up there," she said. "You could have let him slide further into that ravine." Russell met her gaze evenly. "That wouldn't have ended anything." After giving his statement, Russell stepped back into the cold air, feeling lighter than he had in years. Not because justice had been served, not because the danger had passed entirely, but because he had acted without hiding from the memory that had once paralyzed him. That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, Russell found himself alone in his small rental house, flannel jacket draped over a chair. Atlas lay near the fireplace, paws stretched forward, eyes half closed. Russell sat opposite him, staring into the low flames. He thought about the man he had been years ago, crouched behind a concrete barrier in a foreign city, listening to gunfire and indecision. He thought about the split-second choice he had not made then, about the comrade whose name still echoed in his mind. He had convinced himself that hesitation had been survival, but somewhere deep inside he had carried the belief that he had not turned back when he should have. Up on that mountain, when Wade slipped near the frozen ravine and Russell saw the fear in his eyes, he had felt that same moment rising again. Leave him, walk away, let gravity decide. Instead, he had stepped forward, not because Wade deserved mercy, not because forgiveness came easily, but because Russell refused to let the past dictate another outcome. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Russell rose and opened the door to find Reverend Thomas Caldwell standing on the porch, hat in hand. The older man's coat was brushed clean of snow, but his cheeks were pink from the cold. "I thought I'd check on you," Caldwell said gently. "Mountain roads can leave more behind than tire tracks." Russell stepped aside to let him in. The Reverend moved with deliberate care, joints stiff but spirit steady. He had served the community for decades before the chapel closed, officiating weddings and funerals alike. Loss had etched wisdom into his face rather than bitterness. "You did the hard thing," Caldwell remarked, settling into a chair near the fire. "Most men believe strength means walking away from weakness. Few understand it can mean walking toward it." Russell stared at the flames. "I didn't do it for him." "I know," Caldwell replied quietly. "You did it for yourself." Atlas lifted his head slightly at the sound of Russell's voice but remained where he was. The firelight flickered across his aging muzzle. The next morning on Route 6, the atmosphere on the bus felt subtly different. Children spoke in normal tones. No dark blue pickup idled near the school entrance. Nora boarded and walked not to the last seat, but to the second row from the front. She hesitated only a second before sitting there. Atlas followed, lowering himself beside her with less effort than the day before, though Russell noticed the stiffness in his movements. When the bus pulled away, Russell glanced in the mirror. Nora caught his eye briefly and gave a small, tentative smile. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was real. The road ahead remained long. Legal proceedings would follow. Vivian's recovery would take time. Atlas would continue aging in ways Russell could no longer ignore. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Russell no longer viewed himself as a man defined by a single frozen moment from years ago. He had turned back when it mattered. Winter still held Red Hollow in its grip, but the quiet inside Russell had begun to thaw. Spring arrived in Red Hollow without fanfare, as if winter had simply loosened its grip and stepped aside. Snow retreated into the shadows beneath the pines, leaving damp earth and narrow streams that traced their way down the mountainside. The air carried the scent of thawing soil and distant cedar. Russell Vance stood beside Route 6 one morning, green and black flannel shirt worn lighter now that the air no longer bit through bone. Sleeves rolled once at the wrist. Sunlight touched the side of his face, catching faint silver at his temples. Atlas sat beside him, black and tan coat thinner than in winter, muzzle noticeably white, yet posture proud despite the stiffness that lingered in his joints. The months after Wade Mercer's arrest unfolded more quietly than Russell had expected. Legal proceedings took place beyond town limits. State investigators followed the paper trail of the ledger. The mountain pass returned to stillness. For the first time in a long while, Route 6 felt like what it had always been meant to be: a road for children, not a corridor for fear. Vivian Whitaker recovered steadily through late winter. Cardiac adjustments and medications stabilized her condition, and by early March she began volunteering part-time at Red Hollow Elementary's small library. The building itself was modest, brick facade faded by decades of mountain wind. Inside, the library occupied a narrow corner filled with mismatched shelves and well-worn reading rugs. Vivian fit there naturally. She had always been tall and slender, but as strength returned, her posture grew straighter. Her honey-blonde hair, once tied back carelessly in exhaustion, now fell loosely over her shoulders when she worked. The faint scar near her collarbone remained, but she no longer seemed defined by it. She moved gently among the children, recommending books with quiet enthusiasm, her pale blue eyes brightening when she spoke about stories that carried courage and kindness rather than danger. The principal of the school, Margaret Ellison, had been the one to offer Vivian the opportunity. Ellison was a woman in her early 50s, short and solidly built, with graying curls cut close to her head and a voice that carried authority without cruelty. Years earlier, she had lost her husband in a logging accident, an event that had sharpened her sense of responsibility toward every child under her care. She recognized resilience when she saw it. Vivian's calm presence and gentle intelligence were assets the school welcomed. Russell noticed the change first, not in the trailer, but in the bus. On the first morning after spring break, Nora Whitaker boarded Route 6 wearing a pale yellow jacket instead of the heavy winter coat she had clung to for months. Her steps were lighter. Without hesitation, she walked past the middle rows and settled into the very first seat behind Russell's driver position. Atlas rose automatically and shifted to lie partly in the aisle beside her. He no longer made the long trek to the back of the bus. He stayed forward now, where Nora chose to sit. Russell glanced at her in the mirror. "You sure about that spot?" he asked lightly. Nora nodded. "I can see everything from here." The words held no fear, only curiosity. The other children adjusted quickly. A few began to request permission to sit near the front, too, hoping for a closer look at Atlas. The German Shepherd had become something of an unspoken legend in town. The dog who ran through snow, who stood between danger and a child, who aged without complaint. Children reached cautiously to touch the thick fur along his back when allowed. Atlas tolerated it with dignified patience, though Russell watched closely for signs of fatigue. Age had begun to mark Atlas in small but undeniable ways. He rose more slowly from resting positions. His stride shortened slightly during long walks. The once effortless leap into the truck bed now required a brief gathering of strength. Russell noticed each change like a man marking time against a horizon he could not halt. One afternoon, as the bus idled near the school entrance, a small boy named Caleb Morris approached hesitantly. Caleb was 9 years old, slight and freckled, with sandy hair that refused to lie flat no matter how carefully combed. His oversized glasses magnified eyes that were always scanning, always thinking. Caleb had recently transferred from a larger district after his father accepted a forestry position in Red Hollow. He had not yet found his place among the other children. "Is he always this calm?" Caleb asked softly, gesturing toward Atlas. Russell smiled faintly. "He's learned what matters." Caleb crouched carefully beside the dog. Atlas regarded him with steady amber eyes, tail giving one slow thump against the bus floor. The boy reached out tentatively and brushed his fingers along the dog's shoulder. The simple act seemed to steady him. Over the following weeks, Caleb began sitting near the front more often. He asked quiet questions about dogs, about snowstorms, about bravery. Russell answered without embellishment. He had no desire to turn Atlas into myth. The dog was not a symbol. He was simply loyal. As spring deepened, Russell found himself lingering occasionally outside the school library after morning drop-off. Through the window, he could see Vivian shelving books or kneeling beside a group of first graders reading aloud. Nora moved freely between shelves, no longer shrinking at sudden sounds. There were still moments when a loud bang in the hallway caused her shoulders to tense, but they passed quickly now. One late April afternoon, as sunlight filtered warm and golden through the bus windows, Nora leaned forward in her seat and rested her chin near the top of Russell's chair. Atlas lay with his head across her knees. "Will he always be here?" she asked quietly. Russell knew the question did not refer to the bus route. He kept his eyes on the road, the narrow curve leading back toward town. "No," he answered honestly. "None of us are." Nora was silent for a long moment. "That's scary." "It can be," Russell admitted. "But it's also why we don't wait to care." She ran her fingers gently along the silver fur near Atlas's muzzle. The dog closed his eyes briefly, content. Russell thought about the years he had spent convincing himself that distance protected him from loss. He had believed that survival meant narrowing his world to something manageable. But the world had widened again, one small choice at a time. A seat on a bus, a knock at a window, a road turned back instead of abandoned. The bus passed the old chapel road, now quiet and nearly forgotten beneath new green growth. The steeple remained visible in the distance, leaning slightly but standing. Russell felt no bitterness when he glanced that way, only acknowledgement. Later that week, The school hosted a small spring fair on the field behind the building. Children ran between tables painted with bright banners. Vivian manned a booth offering donated books for families to take home. Principal Ellison supervised with hands on hips, scanning for safety hazards with the vigilance of someone who had seen too much unpredictability in life to take calm for granted. Atlas rested in the shade of a maple tree near Russell's folding chair. Children approached in small groups to sit beside him, offering gentle pats and whispered confidences. His ears twitched occasionally, but he remained patient. Russell observed the scene with a quiet satisfaction he did not attempt to name. Sergeant Elena Ramirez appeared briefly near the edge of the fairgrounds, uniform crisp against the bright afternoon. She nodded once toward Russell in acknowledgement before continuing her patrol. There was no drama in the gesture, only mutual recognition of a chapter closed. As evening approached and families dispersed, Russell and Nora walked together toward the bus to prepare for the final route home. Atlas rose slowly, shaking out his coat. The motion seemed to require more effort than it once had, but he completed it without complaint. "Do you miss being alone?" Nora asked suddenly. Russell considered the question carefully. He remembered the quietude of his rental house before any of this began. He remembered the safety of detachment. "No," he said at last. "I don't." Route 6 rolled forward once more through Red Hollow, sunlight glinting off newly budding trees. Children's voices filled the bus with ordinary noise, the kind Russell had once resented but now understood as evidence of life. Nora remained in the first row, Atlas at her side. For years, Russell had thought of himself as a man who had survived something he could not undo. A man defined by what he had not been able to save. But as the bus followed its familiar path through town, he realized that survival had quietly transformed into something else. He was no longer simply enduring days until they passed. He was participating in them. When the bus reached the Whitaker trailer that afternoon, Vivian waited outside, healthier and stronger than she had been the previous winter. Nora stepped down with confidence. Atlas followed carefully, descending the steps slower than before, but steady. Russell watched them for a moment, before closing the bus door and shifting into drive. The engine hummed smoothly. The road ahead stretched open beneath a sky no longer dominated by storm clouds. For the first time in many years, Russell did not feel like a solitary survivor navigating through cold. He felt like a man who had returned, to others and to himself. That summer, Route 6 kept rolling through Red Hollow, the way it always had. But something inside Russell no longer felt stalled between seasons. The mountains were still the same, quiet, patient, indifferent to who came and went. Yet the bus carried laughter now that did not tighten his chest. Nora's voice sometimes drifted forward from the first row, light and certain. Vivian waved from the library steps with color in her cheeks. Atlas, slower but steady, rose each morning and took his place beside the door as if the world still needed guarding. Russell once believed survival was the highest form of strength. Now he understood it was only the beginning. The real work was showing up again the next day, and the day after that. Even when loss had taught you to hide, some mornings, when the sun spilled gold over the windshield and the road stretched clean and open ahead, Russell caught his reflection in the glass and did not see a man haunted by what he had failed to save. He saw a man who had chosen to turn back, and who, at last, had stayed.